In the dimly lit chambers of the Palazzo Vecchio, as the candles flickered against the stone walls of Renaissance Florence, Niccolò Machiavelli bent over his parchment, his quill scratching against the silence of the night. The year was 1513, and the former diplomat had fallen from grace, exiled from the corridors of power he once navigated with such skill. Yet in this moment of personal defeat, he was crafting what would become the most influential treatise on power ever written. The irony was not lost on him. Here was a man who had served the Florentine Republic with unwavering loyalty, who had negotiated with kings and princes, who had witnessed firsthand the brutal machinery of Renaissance politics, now reduced to writing by candlelight in his country estate. But Machiavelli understood something that his contemporaries did not. True power lay not in the throne room or the battlefield, but in understanding the fundamental principles that governed human nature and political reality. As he wrote The Prince, Machiavelli was not merely offering advice to Lorenzo de' Medici, to whom the work was dedicated. He was laying bare the hidden mechanisms of power that had operated since the beginning of civilization. What emerged from his pen was not just a manual for rulers, but a revelation of the laws that governed all human relationships where power was at stake. Law 1: Never outshine the master. Machiavelli had learned this lesson the hard way. His own fall from grace came partly because he had made himself too indispensable, too clever, too obviously superior to those he served. In his analysis of Cesare Borgia, he noted how the young duke had carefully managed his relationship with his father, Pope Alexander VI. Cesare never allowed his military successes to overshadow his father's authority, always framing his victories as extensions of papal power rather than personal achievements. The law operated on a simple principle: those in power were fundamentally insecure about their position. They surrounded themselves with advisors and subordinates not because they wanted to be challenged or improved, but because they needed to feel superior. Machiavelli observed how court favorites rose and fell based not on their competence, but on their ability to make their masters feel wise and powerful. In the courts of France, where Machiavelli had served as an envoy, he witnessed this dynamic repeatedly. King Louis XII kept advisors who confirmed his prejudices rather than challenged his assumptions. When advisors became too prominent or too correct in their predictions, they found themselves quietly removed from influence. The king's ego required that all wisdom appear to emanate from him, even when it clearly originated elsewhere. Law 2: Never put too much trust in friends, learn how to use enemies. The diplomatic world had taught Machiavelli that friendship was a luxury leaders could not afford. Friends expected loyalty, reciprocity, and emotional consideration. Enemies, paradoxically, could be more useful because they were predictable in their opposition and could be converted through strategic incentives. He had watched Cesare Borgia transform bitter enemies into loyal servants through calculated displays of both mercy and strength. When Borgia captured the conspirators who had plotted against him, he did not simply execute them all. Instead, he pardoned some, promoted others, and eliminated only those whose continued existence posed a genuine threat. This surgical approach to dealing with opposition created an atmosphere where former enemies competed to prove their loyalty. Friends, Machiavelli observed, became complacent. They assumed their position was secure based on personal affection rather than mutual benefit. This complacency made them unreliable in crucial moments. Enemies who had been converted, however, knew their position depended entirely on their continued usefulness and loyalty. They worked harder to maintain their status. Law 3: Conceal your intentions. In the chess game of Renaissance politics, Machiavelli understood that transparency was a form of suicide. He had studied the methods of Ferdinand of Aragon, who had united Spain through a combination of marriage diplomacy, religious war, and calculated deception. Ferdinand never revealed his true objectives until he was ready to achieve them. The art of concealment, as Machiavelli practiced it, involved multiple layers of misdirection. First, there was the false intention designed to mislead enemies. Second, there was the partial truth shared with allies to maintain their cooperation without full disclosure. Third, there was the ultimate objective, known only to the leader himself. When Machiavelli served as an envoy to Cesare Borgia, he observed how the Duke would discuss 3 different versions of his plans with 3 different audiences, each believing they possessed his true confidence. This technique served multiple purposes: it confused potential opponents, created false intelligence, and allowed Borgia to test the loyalty of his subordinates based on what information they shared with others. Law 4, always say less than necessary. The diplomatic corps of Renaissance Italy was filled with men who had destroyed their careers through excessive candor. Machiavelli noted how silence created an aura of depth and wisdom that verbose explanation could never achieve. When he attended audiences with Pope Julius II, he observed how the pontiff's dramatic pauses and careful word choice made his pronouncements carry more weight than the lengthy speeches of other church officials. Silence served multiple strategic functions. It prevented the revelation of weaknesses or uncertainties. It forced others to reveal their own positions while keeping one's own counsel. Most importantly, it created an atmosphere of mystery that others filled with their own projections of wisdom and power. In his diplomatic correspondence, Machiavelli often employed deliberate ambiguity. When reporting on military movements or political negotiations, he would provide just enough information to inform his superiors without committing himself to specific predictions or recommendations that could later be used against him. Law 5, so much depends on reputation. Guarded with your life. Reputation, Machiavelli understood, was the foundation upon which all other forms of power rested. A leader's reputation preceded him into every negotiation, every alliance, every conflict. It determined whether enemies would challenge him and whether allies would support him. He had witnessed how quickly reputation could be lost and how difficult it was to rebuild. The fall of Girolamo Savonarola in Florence demonstrated how a reputation for moral authority could be destroyed through a single demonstration of human weakness. Conversely, he observed how Cesare Borgia had built a reputation for ruthless efficiency that made many enemies surrender without fighting. Reputation required constant maintenance and occasional dramatic demonstration. Machiavelli noted how successful leaders staged public displays of their core qualities. If they wished to be known for mercy, they would publicly pardon a notable enemy. If they wanted to be feared, they would make an example of a transgressor in a way that would be remembered and discussed. Law 6, court attention at all costs. In the crowded political landscape of Renaissance Italy, obscurity was equivalent to political death. Machiavelli observed how leaders who failed to command attention quickly found themselves marginalized, regardless of their actual competence or achievements. The key was not merely to be noticed, but to be noticed for the right reasons. Cesare Borgia understood this principle intuitively. His military campaigns were conducted with theatrical flair that ensured they would be discussed in every court in Europe. His public appearances were carefully staged to reinforce his image as a formidable leader. Machiavelli also noted the importance of timing in seeking attention. The wise leader knew when to step forward into the spotlight and when to remain in shadow. During periods of uncertainty or crisis, visibility could be dangerous. During moments of triumph or opportunity, invisibility was wasteful. Law 7, get others to do the work for you, but always take the credit. The complexity of governance required delegation, but the perception of leadership demanded that all success appear to flow from the leader himself. Machiavelli had observed this principle in operation throughout the Italian states. Successful princes surrounded themselves with capable subordinates but ensured that public recognition always flowed upward. This law required a delicate balance. Subordinates needed to feel sufficiently rewarded to maintain their loyalty and effectiveness. However, they could never be allowed to build independent power bases or public recognition that might threaten their master's position. Cesare Borgia demonstrated this principle in his use of Ramiro de Lorqua as his administrator in Romagna. Borgia allowed de Lorqua to implement harsh but necessary reforms, building efficiency and order in the region. However, when the reforms had been completed and the harshness was no longer necessary, Borgia dramatically executed de Lorqua in the public square, simultaneously taking credit for the positive changes while distancing himself from their unpopular methods. Part 2, the hidden mechanisms of control. As Machiavelli delved deeper into his analysis of power, he began to uncover the psychological mechanisms that made political control possible. These were not the noble principles taught in universities or preached from pulpits, but the actual forces that moved human beings to obey, to follow, to submit to authority. Law 8, make other people come to you. Use bait if necessary. The geography of power, Machiavelli realized, was as important as its psychology. Those who controlled the location and timing of encounters controlled the encounters themselves. In his diplomatic career, he had learned to read the significance of where meetings were held, who traveled to whom, and under what circumstances negotiations took place. When Pope Julius II demanded that the French king come to him rather than meeting on neutral ground, he was asserting papal supremacy before any words were spoken. The act of compelling another party to come to you demonstrated superiority and created psychological advantage. The visiting party was operating on unfamiliar ground, subject to the host's rules and customs. This principle extended beyond formal negotiations. In daily political life, successful leaders created circumstances that required others to seek them out. They positioned themselves as gatekeepers of resources, information, or access that others needed. This positioning ensured a steady stream of supplicants who reinforced the leader's importance through their very presence. Law 9, win through your actions, never through argument. Machiavelli had spent countless hours in council chambers listening to eloquent speeches that changed nothing. He had watched skilled orators lose political battles to men of action who demonstrated their points rather than arguing them. The Renaissance was an age of debate and intellectual sophistication, yet practical power belonged to those who shaped reality rather than those who merely described it. Cesare Borgia never engaged in lengthy justifications of his policies. When he needed to demonstrate his authority, he acted decisively and publicly. When the city of Faenza resisted his rule, he did not send ambassadors to argue his case. Instead, he besieged the city until it surrendered, then treated the defeated population with calculated magnanimity. The lesson was unmistakable: resistance was futile, but submission would be rewarded. Arguments invited counter-arguments and created the impression that the matter was open to debate. Actions created facts that others had to accept or challenge at significant cost. The wise leader spoke through deeds, allowing others to construct whatever rationalizations they needed to accept the new reality. Law 10, infection. Avoid the unhappy and unlucky. During his years of diplomatic service, Machiavelli had observed how misfortune seemed to spread from person to person like a contagion. Those who associated with the unlucky or the unsuccessful found their own reputations tainted by proximity. This was not merely superstition, but a practical reality of political life. Unlucky people tended to be unlucky for reasons related to their character, judgment, or circumstances. These same factors that brought them misfortune could affect those around them. More importantly, being seen in the company of the unsuccessful created an association in observers' minds between oneself and failure. Machiavelli noted how successful leaders carefully managed their associations. They might privately assist unlucky friends or former allies, but they avoided public connection with them. When circumstances forced interaction with the unfortunate, successful leaders found ways to demonstrate that the association was charitable rather than collaborative. Law 11, learn to keep people dependent on you. Independence was the enemy of control. Machiavelli understood that lasting power required creating relationships where others needed you more than you needed them. This principle operated at every level of political life, from the relationship between prince and subject to the dynamics between allies. The most effective way to create dependence was to position yourself as the exclusive source of something essential: information, resources, access, or protection. Cesare Borgia excelled at this strategy. He made himself indispensable to his father by being the only person who could effectively command the papal armies. He made himself necessary to local nobles by being their only reliable protection against French or Spanish intervention. Creating dependence required careful calculation. If the dependency was too obvious or too onerous, it would generate resentment and eventual resistance. The art lay in making people feel that their reliance on you was natural, mutually beneficial, and freely chosen. Law 12, use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victim. Complete honesty was political suicide, but selective honesty could be a powerful weapon. Machiavelli had observed how strategic displays of candor could create trust that could later be exploited. The key was choosing moments when honesty served your interests rather than undermined them. When Cesare Borgia admitted his mistakes in his dealings with the Orsini family, he was not displaying weakness but demonstrating strength. His willingness to acknowledge errors created an impression of fair-mindedness that made his eventual betrayal of the family more shocking and effective. By appearing honest in small matters, he created credibility that he could spend in larger ones. Generosity operated according to similar principles. Strategic displays of magnanimity could purchase loyalty more effectively than consistent fair dealing. A single dramatic gesture of generosity created a lasting impression that could excuse numerous small acts of selfishness. Law 13, when asking for help, appeal to people's self-interest, never their mercy or gratitude. Human nature was fundamentally selfish, and effective leaders worked with this reality rather than against it. Machiavelli had witnessed countless appeals for assistance based on past favors, shared values, or moral obligations. These appeals rarely succeeded, and, when they did, the assistance provided was grudging and temporary. Self-interest, however, was a reliable motivator. When Machiavelli needed support from various Italian cities for Florentine policies, he learned to frame his requests in terms of the benefits that cooperation would bring to his potential allies. Rather than appealing to their sense of justice or their friendship with Florence, he demonstrated how supporting his proposals would advance their own goals. This principle required thorough understanding of what others actually wanted rather than what they claimed to want. Public statements about values and priorities were often misleading. Effective persuasion required identifying the real interests that drove behavior and appealing to those rather than to stated ideals. Law 14, pose as a friend, work as a spy. Information was the currency of power, and the most valuable information was that which others sought to conceal. Machiavelli's diplomatic career had been built on his ability to gather intelligence about the true intentions and capabilities of other states. This intelligence gathering required skills that went far beyond formal negotiation. The most effective spies were those who were not recognized as such. By presenting himself as a sympathetic friend or potential ally, an information gatherer could encourage others to reveal far more than they intended. Machiavelli learned to ask questions that seemed motivated by friendly concern rather than strategic interest. This approach required genuine skill in human psychology. Successful intelligence gathering meant making others feel comfortable, understood, and valued. The information they provided had to feel like sharing rather than interrogation. The most successful practitioners of this art genuinely enjoy human interaction, making their attention feel authentic rather than calculated. Part 3, the ultimate mastery. In the final phase of his analysis, Machiavelli moves beyond tactics to strategy, beyond individual maneuvers to comprehensive systems of control. These were the principles that separated temporary success from lasting dominance, that distinguished skilled practitioners from true masters of power. Law 15, crush your enemy totally. Half measures in dealing with enemies were not mercy but stupidity. Machiavelli had studied the history of Rome and observed how the Republic's greatest mistakes came from failing to completely eliminate threats. An enemy left partially defeated was an enemy given time to recover, learn from their mistakes, and plan revenge. The destruction of enemies, however, had to be accomplished in a way that did not create new enemies among their allies or followers. Cesare Borgia demonstrated this principle when he eliminated the Orsini and Colonna families as political threats. He did not simply kill individual members, he systematically destroyed their power base, redistributed their lands, and co-opted their followers. Total victory required understanding that the goal was not punishment but neutralization. Sometimes this could be accomplished through exile, sometimes through co-optation, sometimes through economic pressure. Physical elimination was only one tool among many, and often not the most effective. Law 16, use absence to increase respect and honor. Familiarity bred not just contempt but complacency. Machiavelli observed how leaders who were always available, always visible, gradually lost their mystique and authority. Constant presence allowed others to study their weaknesses, to take their attention for granted, and to forget their power. Strategic absence served multiple functions. It created anticipation and heightened the impact of eventual appearances. It prevented enemies from studying and predicting behavior patterns. Most importantly, it forced others to function independently, making them appreciate the leader's value when he returned. The key was distinguishing between absence that suggested strength and absence that suggested weakness. A leader who disappeared during crises appeared to be fleeing. A leader who withdrew after establishing clear policies and delegating authority appeared to be demonstrating confidence in his systems and subordinates. Law 17, keep others in suspended terror, cultivate an air of unpredictability. Predictable leaders became manageable leaders. Once others understood a leader's patterns, priorities, and emotional triggers, they could manipulate him rather than being controlled by him. Machiavelli noted how the most effective rulers maintained an element of uncertainty in their behavior that kept potential opponents off balance. Cesare Borgia excelled at strategic unpredictability. His enemies never knew whether he would respond to provocation with immediate violence, calculated patience, or apparent indifference. This uncertainty made it difficult for them to plan effective opposition or to test the limits of his tolerance. Unpredictability, however, could not be random. It had to serve strategic purposes and maintain internal consistency. The goal was to be unpredictable to enemies while remaining comprehensible to allies and subordinates who needed to coordinate their actions with yours. Law 18. Do not build fortresses to protect yourself. Isolation is dangerous. Physical fortifications created illusions of security that were often more dangerous than actual vulnerability. Machiavelli had observed how leaders who isolated themselves behind walls and guards lost touch with political reality and became easy targets for the very threats they sought to avoid. True security came from maintaining networks of information, influence, and alliance that provided early warning of threats and multiple options for response. A leader surrounded by loyal supporters in the heart of political life was safer than a leader hiding behind fortifications on the periphery. The principle extended beyond physical security to political and social isolation. Leaders who surrounded themselves only with yes-men and flatterers created their own form of fortress that was equally dangerous. They lost the ability to receive accurate information about changing circumstances and gradually became vulnerable to threats they could not see. Law 19. Know who you're dealing with. Do not offend the wrong person. Not all enemies were equal, and not all offenses carried the same consequences. Machiavelli's diplomatic experience had taught him to carefully assess the power, connections, and character of those he encountered. Some people could be safely dismissed or antagonized, others required careful handling regardless of their apparent importance. The dangerous person was not always the obviously powerful one. Sometimes a seemingly minor official had connections or information that could cause significant problems. Sometimes a person of limited current power had potential for future influence that made present antagonism costly. This principle required sophisticated intelligence about the social and political networks that actually operated beneath the formal structures of power. Understanding who had influence with whom, who owed favors to whom, and who held grudges against whom was essential for navigating complex political environments. Law 20. Do not commit to anyone. Independence was the foundation of power. The moment a leader became completely committed to any person, faction, or ideology, he lost his freedom to maneuver and became predictable to his enemies. Machiavelli observed how the most successful rulers maintained multiple options and avoided binding themselves irrevocably to any single course of action. This did not mean being unreliable or untrustworthy in obvious ways. Rather, it meant structuring commitments so that they served your interests rather than constraining them. Successful leaders made others dependent on them while avoiding becoming equally dependent on others. The art lay in appearing committed while retaining practical flexibility. This could be accomplished through careful language in agreements, by building escape clauses into treaties, or by maintaining alternative alliances that could be activated if primary relationships failed. Law 21. Play a sucker to catch a sucker. Seem dumber than your mark. The greatest advantage in any contest was being underestimated by one's opponents. Machiavelli had observed how intelligent leaders sometimes concealed their capabilities to encourage enemies to become overconfident and careless. By appearing less capable than they actually were, they could gather information, identify threats, and position themselves advantageously. This principle required genuine skill in performance and psychology. The appearance of weakness or simplicity had to be convincing without actually limiting effectiveness. It meant allowing others to feel superior while maintaining actual superiority in preparation and understanding. Cesare Borgia occasionally employed this tactic when dealing with other Italian princes who assumed that his youth and political inexperience made him easy to manipulate. By allowing them to believe they were outwitting him while he gathered intelligence about their real intentions and capabilities, he positioned himself to neutralize them when the time was right. As Machiavelli completed his analysis, he understood that he had created something unprecedented, a systematic examination of power that stripped away moral pretensions and sentimental illusions to reveal the actual mechanisms by which human societies were governed. These 21 laws were not prescriptions for evil but descriptions of reality. They explained how power actually worked rather than how people wished it worked. The princes and politicians who followed these principles were not necessarily more cruel or selfish than those who ignored them. They were simply more realistic about human nature and more effective in achieving their goals. In a world where everyone sought advantage and no one could be trusted completely, these laws provided a framework for survival and success. Machiavelli knew his insights would be controversial. They challenged the comfortable myths that people told themselves about politics and morality. They suggested that effective leadership required skills and attitudes that were incompatible with conventional virtue. Yet he also knew that understanding these realities was essential for anyone who sought to navigate successfully in a world where power determined outcomes. The candlelight flickered as he set down his quill, the shadows dancing across pages that would influence political thinking for centuries to come. In revealing the hidden laws that governed the exercise of power, Machiavelli had not created these realities but simply illuminated them. The choice facing future leaders would not be whether to acknowledge these laws but whether to master them or be mastered by those who did. In the end, Machiavelli's greatest insight was that power was neither good nor evil in itself but simply a force that could be wielded skillfully or clumsily, consciously or unconsciously. Those who understood its true nature could use it to create stability, prosperity, and progress. Those who remained ignorant of its realities would find themselves its victims rather than its masters. The laws he had discovered were not invitations to tyranny but tools for effectiveness in an imperfect world where good intentions alone were never sufficient to achieve good results.